No, you're not determined to watch this video. Tonight, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Chris Franklin, who is a libertarian. He believes in libertarian free will, and he's going to be defending that tonight. By the end of this interview, you'll not only know what libertarianism is, you'll hear arguments for it, and you'll hear Dr. Franklin respond to objections to it. So thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Franklin.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So I've done three other interviews that precede this one. This is for now, the last in the series. I may expand it later, but I've had on Dr. Taylor Sear, who just kind of gave us an overview of views on human freedom. And then I interviewed Dirk Perryboom, and he defended this skeptical view that humans don't have free will. And then I interviewed Dr. Guillaume Bignon, and he defended compatibilism. And so now we've reached the last view, libertarianism. So just to begin, can you first tell us what is libertarianism?
Sure. So you saved the best for last, I guess, right?
Yeah, my own view, cards on the table. I'm telling everyone I'm a libertarian.
That's right. So kind of as we work our way into libertarianism, let's just start with some background definitions so we're able to set the context. Obviously, often when people hear I'm a libertarian, the first thing they think of is politics. So not that kind of libertarian. So when we think of libertarianism, we can begin first by trying to say what free will is. Now, this itself is a controversial issue, but I'll try to offer a definition of free will that I think is both very, very widely accepted. Probably not everyone accepts it, but very widely accepted in the contemporary literature. And also, I think if you look at kind of the main historical figures, that they probably accepted something like this definition of free will as well. So free will on this definition is simply the strongest control condition, whatever exactly that turns out to be, that's necessary for an agent's being morally responsible for a choice in action. So on this definition of free will, rather than saying exactly what free will is, we explain how free will functions in an account of moral responsibility. So free will is just whatever kind of control it takes, the ability to do otherwise, the ability to be the ultimate source of your action. People have different views on this, but whatever it turns out to be, it is that kind of control such that if you had it, you would be morally responsible for your action. If you read historical figures, if you read some of the most ancient sources on this, like the Stoics, or even a little later, like someone like Augustine or Boethius, they don't get very far in talking about free will before they talk about moral responsibility. Notice also, though, on this definition of free will, then we immediately have to say what moral responsibility is before we can wonder about free will. So what's moral responsibility? Well, as you can imagine, this is controversial as well. I'm going to give a definition, actually one that will be quite similar to what Dirk Perryboom thinks moral responsibility is. So on this definition, an agent's morally responsible for performing a choice or an action, just in case she would deserve praise if that choice or action went beyond what could reasonably be expected of her, or would deserve blame, or if her choice or action was morally wrong. Now, for simplicity's sake, let's just focus on the blame portion of that. So a couple of thoughts. First, it's important to see that on this account of moral responsibility, to be morally responsible means not just that you're fitting to be blamed or that it would be appropriate to blame you, but that you would deserve blame. Now, that's important because we can think of cases in which it would be fitting or appropriate or reasonable to blame people, but they don't deserve it. So take a case of child punishment, right? My young daughter heads toward the electrical outlet with a fork, right? I flick her finger because she deserves it. Well, no, not because she deserves it, but rather because by flicking her finger, I can help prevent her from incurring serious bodily harm. So sometimes we punish people, maybe even sometimes we blame people, not because they deserve it, but because by doing so, we can reform their character or deter further consequences or something like this. But the thought is that when an agent deserves blame, then there's a strong reason to blame them simply because they did wrong. Right. So on this view, maybe it will turn out that this person won't reform their character if I blame him. Maybe it won't deter anybody else from doing a similar kind of action. But nonetheless, if he's done something that deserves blame, I have good reason to blame him simply because of what he's done. Now, on this view of responsibility, questions of control seem really, really important, right? My flicking of my child's finger has nothing to do with their control. It has to do with, maybe I have a bad view of human psychology, but the thought is by doing that, I'm going to encourage her not to perform that kind of action again. But if I'm blaming someone simply because they did something, then it seems like they had to have control over that kind of thing. And here the thought is free will is precisely that kind of control. If you're free in performing your action, then the action is such that you would deserve blame in the case that you did something wrong. So on this view, free will and moral responsibility are intimately linked. And when we think about what it would take to be free, we have to think about what it would take to make the agent deserve blame. That's what we're wondering about. What kind of control would the agent have to deserve blame if they did wrong?
Excellent.
All right.
Okay. So yeah, we're clear on what free will is, what moral responsibility is. And everyone I've interviewed so far agrees on, I feel like, at least that much.
Yeah.
So I think Dirk Perryboom has a different kind of conception of moral responsibility on how it works on his skeptical view. But I feel like at least he agrees, hey, on this conception, yeah, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the control necessary for moral responsibility. We have this type of free will in mind. Yeah. So I feel like everyone's with you on that part.
Yeah, you're right. There's been a lot of literature, particularly like in the last 20, maybe 30 years, and Dirk's an important contributor to this, of thinking about maybe different strands. Sometimes they're called different faces or different kinds of moral responsibility. So someone like Perryboom, who's going to be skeptical that we meet or have the kind of responsibility I've defined, might think there's other notions of responsibility that are worth picking up on and thinking about. So sometimes what I'm calling moral responsibility gets called moral accountability in the literature. But I think you're right that most people think, well, if that's how we're defining responsibility, then yeah, free will seems really important for that.
Yeah.
So now two more definitions. Maybe I'll throw a couple more in there, and then we can actually say what libertarianism is. So incompatibilism. So philosophers aren't very creative with their names. What's incompatibilism? It's just the view that free will is incompatible with determinism. And we'll also be talking about the contradictory of that view, right? Compatibilism, which says that free will is compatible with determinism. So incompatibilism, it says if you've got determinism, you've got no free will. Compatibilism says it's possible to have a world that's both deterministic and has free agents. Okay, but what do we mean by determinism? This is a really slippery notion. If you've ever stayed up late arguing with people about free will, determinism comes up, and people often have very different ideas behind this. So let's start with a very abstract statement of determinism, which says that it's the thesis that every event that occurs is the inevitable consequence of some condition C. Now, the reason I've said it that way is because it turns out there's different species of determinism. So take theological determinism, which will be relevant to our discussion tonight. On that view, it contends that every event that occurs, for example, my speaking with Jordan this evening, is an inevitable consequence of God's eternal decrees. Contrast theological determinism with something like physical determinism. On physical determinism, I would say my speaking with Jordan tonight is the inevitable consequence of the past and laws of nature. Now, what makes both these theses determinisms is it's saying everything that happens is inevitable. Other words, we could say is guaranteed by or necessitated by some condition. But they might cite different conditions. Theological determinism typically would cite God's decrees. Physical determinism would cite the distant past, what was happening billions of years ago in the physical laws of nature. We can imagine other kinds of determinism, maybe something like psychological determinism or social determinism. We'll leave those off. The really important ones for us tonight will be physical and theological. Just one of the most important things to see about determinism is determinism doesn't say everything that happens must happen. Rather, it says everything must happen given some further conditions. So this is a form of what we call conditional necessity. So for example, if you think theological determinism is true, you could think it's possible that I didn't speak with Jordan tonight. You would just think that if I wasn't, that would mean God decreed something different. So right, the contention is that given God's decree, I can't, right, what I do is inevitable, but that doesn't mean what I do is inevitable, because after all, God could have decreed something else to happen. Or same thing with physical determinism. Maybe there are some random happenings at the very beginning of the Big Bang, and it could have gone a little differently this way or a little differently that way, such that the Big Bang been slightly different, then what I was doing this evening would be slightly different as well.
Excellent. Okay, so there's determinism, and now we get to the crux here, libertarianism. So what? I'll ask again, but all that was necessary to build up. What is libertarianism now?
Right. So libertarianism is the conjunction of two theses. So libertarianism contends that incompatibilism is true, and it also asserts that we have free will. So a couple of things important to appreciate about this. Not every incompatibilist is a libertarian, but nonetheless, libertarianism is committed to incompatibilism. So often, if you do work in this or read about this, you'll find libertarians arguing a lot with compatibilists. And the one thing they're going to be arguing about is that first claim, namely that compatibilism is true. Notice also, though, that the libertarians, unlike, say, something like a Dirk Peerboom type view, are free will, I guess, existentialists, right? Rather than free will nihilists. That is, we say free will exists, right? Some agents are free. Now, a couple of thoughts about that second claim. First, this doesn't mean, for example, every agent that's ever existed is free, or for example, every human's free. There could be certain kinds of cognitive defects such that those rob people of freedom. So it's not necessarily saying every human that's ever existed is free. Moreover, even for agents who are free, it's not saying everything they do is free. Suppose most of my actions are free. There could still be cases in which I find myself, for whatever reason, manipulated by, I don't know, Facebook, something like this, such that my action turns out not to be free. Rather, when we say we're free, I mean, we mean something kind of vague here, but it's something like much of what we do is free, and for many of us, or something like that. So that's libertarianism. Now, notice a key commitment of libertarianism is that indeterminism, right, obtains, right? In other words, the libertarian is committed to saying there are some events such that even holding fixed, say, the past and laws of nature, I could have done differently. So if my action, according to a libertarian count of talking to Jordan, was free tonight, then holding fixed everything about me, my psychology, my motives, my preferences, my desires, I could have chosen not to do this. I could have chosen to watch TV instead. So that's a really important commitment, right? And libertarians debate where or what should be undetermined and how exactly to think about that. Maybe we'll get into the details, but all libertarians, regardless of exactly how they work out in their accounts, have this commitment to some events being undetermined.
Okay, so before we move on to why you think libertarianism is true, we're about to get there. 2 questions. One comes from the live chat. BDS asked this. Determinism equals the future is closed, but indeterminism equals the future is open, right? What would you say to that?
Well, depends what they mean by open and closed. So sometimes people use words like that to get at the question of whether or not there are now truths about what will happen in the future. So there's this famous discussion in Aristotle's on interpretation of whether or not, from his perspective, it's now true that there'll be a sea battle tomorrow. And the worry is, if it's now true that there'll be a sea battle tomorrow, then it seems like all the agents involved in the sea battle won't be free, because after all, it's already true. But then the worry is if you say, right, it's now false that there'll be a sea battle tomorrow. By sea battle, I don't mean the letter C, I mean a battle at sea. Then it also looks like the agents aren't free because there's nothing they can do to bring it about that there is a sea battle. And so it looks like Aristotle says something like it's neither true nor false. There's a logical principle known as the law of excluded middle that says for every proposition P, it's either true or false. And Aristotle says for what are called future contingents, propositions about the future that intuitively seem like could be true or false, don't now have a truth value. Now, look, if a sea battle happens tomorrow, it will then become true, but it isn't now true. And that's often called the open future view, right? This thought is that there aren't now truths about whether or not, about what will happen in the future. Now, it's controversial whether or not a libertarian has to go that way. It actually seems to me like most libertarians don't think the future is opened. I'm actually not sure that's true, but a lot of libertarians believe in a view called eternalism that says all times exist. and will be such that there are now truths about those future times. So certainly, well, it seems like an open future view is going to commit you to something like indeterminism. But the question is, does indeterminism commit you to something like the future view? I suppose the best thing to say about that is really controversial.
Okay. So the other clarifying question that I had for you was, what is the difference between... So there's two different types of libertarianism. At least there's two that I'm aware of. Agent causal libertarianism versus event causal. If I'm not mistaken, you are an event causal libertarian. So okay, I may be wrong about that. So can you explain what that distinction is?
Yeah, so there's actually three main varieties of libertarianism. There's something called non-causal libertarianism. Sometimes the most famous defender of that is Carl Genet. He actually wasn't a libertarian, so that's not a quite right citation, but he at least developed the view. So it seems, take a free choice. Suppose an agent performs a free choice and there's a bunch of libertarians in the room and they're arguing with each other. Like, what has to be true of that free choice? Well, it's got to be undetermined, right? We're incompatibilists after all. But what else has to be true about it? Well, intuitively, a choice is free only if you bring it about. But now the question is, what do we mean by bring it about? Well, the non-causalist says we don't mean causation. You don't cause your free choices. So we'll put that one aside. There are some interesting people who are developing that view, but that tends to be a rather unpopular view because control just intuitively seems to be a causal notion. You control things partly by causing or preventing things from happening. The agent causal libertarian and agent causal libertarian then are agreed against the non-causalist that a free choice has to be brought about, and we have to understand bring it about in a causal way. But now we ask the question, what do we mean when we say an agent brings something about? Here's what the event causalist says. She says, look, for an agent to bring something about just means that certain events and states involving the agent bring their action about. So what might those events and states be? Well, suppose I'm eating a BLT, which is something I often do. Why am I doing that? Because I believe BLTs, right? I've got a desire, right, to eat a BLT, right, or to enjoy a scrumptious meal, let's say. And I believe that by eating a BLT, I'll enjoy a scrumptious meal. And so that desire and that belief cause me to eat the BLT. Now, of course, I am causing myself to eat the BLT, but that reduces or just comes out to certain states and events involving me, say desires, beliefs, could be more complex, emotions, intentions, things like that, causing me to do that. The agent causalist, and I'll try to say this in a way that's neutral, the agent causalist is going to hear that story I just said and say at least this, that's not enough. Sure, maybe your desires are causally influential, maybe your beliefs are causally influential, but hey, look, you're not your desire. You're also not your belief. When you freely act, you, as an agent, not merely desires and beliefs, bring about your action. So often the way to describe the difference is you say both event and agent causalist believe free action requires agent to cause the action. But the event causalist thinks agent causation just reduces to event causation. For an agent to cause something just means certain desires, certain beliefs, certain intentions, whatever, cause the action. And that's what agent causation is. The agent causalist is a non-reductivist. She says, no. There's more to agent causation than that.
Okay, that's helpful. So, okay, now let's get to a big question for you. You're a libertarian. Why do you think libertarianism is true?
Sure. So I'll talk about kind of two, assuming we have time, kind of two main reasons for this. So the first has come to be called the consequence argument. Now, this is a very, very ancient argument. Arguably, you can find it in the Iliad in a famous scene in when Agamemnon says, I'm not responsible for doing that crazy stuff with Achilles, like the gods made me do it. And the thought is something like, a very intuitive way of presenting the consequence argument is the thought something like, if our actions are the consequences of things beyond our control, then we can't be responsible for our actions. But look, if determinism is true, then everything we do is the inevitable consequence. Let's take physical determinism. Everything's the inevitable consequence of what happened billions of years ago in the laws of nature. but it's not up to you what happened billions of years ago. And the laws of nature aren't up to you. And therefore, your actions aren't up to you either. And so it's also for theological determinism. If everything I do is the inevitable consequence of God's decrees, it's not up to me what God's decrees. And so then my actions aren't up to me either. So that's the intuitive idea.
You laid this out. So we can read this argument here.
Sure.
It looks like there's 4 steps.
So one thing to think, as we develop this argument, I'm going to develop it in a way that bases it on the idea that free will requires, at minimum, the ability to do otherwise. Here, I just want to flag that's a controversial claim, even among libertarians. There are libertarians, sometimes they're called source libertarians, that think really what matters for freedom is not the ability to do otherwise, but being what they would call the indeterministic causal source of your action. That, I think, is an interesting view. Also, perhaps you can modify the consequence argument. But here, I'm just going to assume that free will requires the ability to do otherwise, I suppose, for 2 reasons. I think most libertarians assume that, both historically and in the contemporary scene, and I think just most people assume that. So it seems like if what I did was something I'm responsible for, then it must be that I was able to avoid it. It doesn't seem fair to blame me for action unless I was in some way able to avoid it, right? So we can imagine some friend, Sam, who's borrowed a book from you and has promised to return the book on a certain occasion and just decides not to. They were engrossed in a novel. In that case, we think, well, some blame, not a ton of blame, but some blame would be fitting. After all, they made the promise. They were supposed to return the book. They've caused me this inconvenience for no good reason, and they easily could have done it. But if we imagine a kind of wild scenario in which thieves come into Sam's house, tie him up, rob him, and he ends up not returning the book, if we discovered that, I'm pretty sure all of us would say, well, we shouldn't blame him in that case. He doesn't deserve blame because after all, he was tied up and there was simply nothing he could have done to return the book. Okay, so what explains the difference between the 2 cases? Well, the thought is, well, in one case, he had the ability to do otherwise, and in one case, he didn't. So maybe we can return to that, but that's the intuitive idea. So here's the consequence argument. This is made, again, famous by Peter Van Wagen in his wonderful 1983 book, Essay on Free Will, but there's many versions of it. And this one definitely owes quite a bit to him, though it's slightly different than his presentation. I've just simplified it a little bit. So premise 1 says this. So let's, again, focus on Sam. If determinism is true, then Sam's refraining from returning the book is an inevitable consequence of the past and laws of nature. So let's focus again on physical determinism. Here, the important thing to see about premise 1 is that's true by definition. If you object to that, that means you don't understand determinism, right? So 1 is just true by definition. If physical determinism is true, right, and Sam is in a deterministic world and Sam refrains from returning the book, then that was inevitable given the past and laws of nature. Okay, the real action and controversy come in the next 2 claims. So premise 2 says, if Sam was able to return the book, then given determinism, he was able to change either the past or the laws of nature. Premise 3 says, but Sam was not able to change the past and laws of nature, right? Therefore, if determinism is true, Sam was not able to return the book. Okay, so 4 follows from 1, 2, and 3. One's true by definition, but of course you might wonder why believe 2 or 3? Let's start with 3. I think that's a little bit more of an intuitive one. Sam's not able to change the past. Sam's not able to change the laws of nature. Now, we're not always sure what the laws of nature are. So the point is not that something we now think is a law of nature could never be discovered to be false because, sometimes we think certain things are laws of nature and we're mistaken about it. But the thought is, if something is truly a law of nature, if it's truly a law of nature that I can't travel faster than the speed of light, then there's nothing I can do to change that, right? There's no strength I can develop, right? There's no kind of technology I can develop that's going to violate that law. So also, there's nothing I can now do to change the past. And this is something I think we all experience both intuitively and in many cases painfully, right? You do something dumb. You really wish you didn't do it, but it's over and done with. It's past. There's nothing you can now do about it. So I think intuitively, it doesn't seem like Sam can now do anything about what the laws of nature are. Those aren't up to him. Maybe those are up to God, but those aren't up to him. Also, he can't now do anything about what happened, say, billions of years ago before he was even born. I mean, he can't even do anything now about what happened yesterday. So the past seems over and done with, beyond his control. What about 2? This one, I think is harder to see. So I've got a little blurb at the bottom of the slide just trying to defend 2. So why should you think 2 is true? Well, so here's a very kind of general defense of it. Suppose I'm able to X, and suppose C is a necessary condition for X is occurring, and C does not obtain. It would seem to follow that if I'm able to X, then I'm able to bring about C. So let me give you some cases to both make that clear and hopefully motivate it. So let's suppose I'm able to run. And let's suppose that a necessary condition for me running is being in something like a standing position. Then notice I'm not now in a standing position. I'm sitting down. So it would seem to follow that if I'm able to run, I have to be able to bring it about that I'm in a standing position. Now, of course, I won't demonstrate this ability, but I am able to bring it about that I'm in a standing condition. And so intuitively, it seems like I'm able to run. Let me give you another case. You just have to take my word for this one. Suppose I'm able to run a mile in under 5 minutes, right? Well, necessary condition for that would be I'm in much better shape than I am. I'd have to be much stronger and so on and so forth. But notice I can't now do anything to bring it at least immediately about that I'm in that condition, whatever exactly it is, for running a mile in under 5 minutes. So then it would seem to follow that I'm not able to run a mile in under 5 minutes. And of course, if you ask why, the answer seems to be something like, well, I'd have to be much stronger than I am, and I can't now do anything about that. Now, maybe, I actually doubt I could even do this, but maybe I could enter a regiment such that over years, I get to the point where I could run a mile under 5 minutes. But I can't now do anything about that. So again, the idea seems to be that if a necessary condition for my doing something doesn't obtain, then I can do that thing only if I can bring about that necessary condition. Okay, turn back to premise 2 for a second. Notice, given determinism, a necessary condition for Sam's returning his book is that either the past is different or the laws are different. Now, you have to think about determinism for a second to see that. But remember, we're imagining a deterministic world in which Sam refrains, so he doesn't return the book. Well, if that world's deterministic, then Sam's returning the book, or excuse me, his refraining from returning the book is inevitable, is necessary, given the past and laws. What does that mean? Well, that means a necessary condition for his actually returning the book, doing something differently, is one of 2 things. The past is different, or the laws are different. But given my little principle at the bottom, then that means that if Sam's able to return the book, then he's got to be able to change either the past or change the laws. But it seems crazy to think he could do either. Thus, if determinism is true, Sam is not able to return the book. Now, I focused on Sam. I've focused on returning the book. But if you think about that argument, you'll realize it'll apply to all agents in all deterministic worlds.
Okay. So does this argument function as, going back to the definition of libertarianism, you have to support 2 theses, right? Okay. And one of them is indeterminism. This seems like it's an argument for that thesis of indeterminism is true. Precisely because if determinism is true, then Sam's doesn't have alternative possibilities, and we've kind of cooked into our notion of freedom here alternative possibilities.
Right. Yeah. Good question. So what does the consequence argument get you? Doesn't get you libertarianism. Because it doesn't get you free will. Notice what the consequence argument is intended to show is that free will is incompatible with determinism. But notice you could think then determinism's true, and so what follows is you've got no free will, right? So you can imagine someone who would accept the consequence.
Incompatibilism. This functions as an argument.
That's right. Yeah. So the consequence argument just gets you that first conjunction of incompatibilism. So why else will think we have free will? Well, libertarians, I think, actually tend not to say too much about this. I think there's a variety of reasons for that. There's different ways of motivating this, but I think the thought is, I think most libertarians would want to say something like this. It's pretty intuitive that we're free. That's something we would share with the compatibilist. Like if Taylor was here, both of us would say it's pretty intuitive. We're free. Now we have different conceptions of what freedom comes to, but we all have many, many situations in our lives, both first personally where I do something and it seems like I'm really guilty for having done that. But notice on my definition of free will, if I'm guilty for having done that, that means I deserve blame, which means I must have been free. Moreover, we have many kind of third personal where we witness someone else doing something and say it's really obvious that, Hitler deserves blame for what he's done. But if he deserves blame for what he's done, then he has to be free. So typically the second feature that we are free, there are some people who try to say we can just kind of see we're libertarians from introspection, like we can just see it from the inside. That strikes me as pretty implausible. What seems to me maybe you can see from the inside is you are free. Now there's a further question of what that freedom comes to. As far as I can see, that leaves open compatibilism being true or libertarianism. So actually, I guess I don't have much in this lecture to say by way of defending the second one. We could kind of say more, but for most people, the thought is something like that's the default position. If someone like Peerboom wants to persuade us of free will skepticism, he's got a burden, because free will, in the sense of what's required for moral responsibility, seems incredibly intuitive insofar as it's manifest kind of across time, across social practices, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's helpful. I wonder, before you get to the second argument, I may ask another follow-up here. So Taylor Sears said something interesting in maybe Dr. Bignon's interview, and that was, we typically assume compatibilism as like the default. Not just in the, like, anytime we've got like two theses, just kind of your default is, well, those things we'll just assume are compatible unless you present an argument to show that they're incompatible. I wonder, do you agree with that kind of general principle of, hey, we just assume things are compatible unless we got some reason to think they're incompatible?
I do. Yeah, that seems exactly right to me. I mean, if you have to really think here for a minute of just how weak of a claim it is to say two propositions P and Q are logically compatible. It's such a weak claim that it seems to me, unless there's a reason to think they're incompatible, you're justified in assuming they're compatible. So it's a little I think if we're talking about free will, I think it might throw people for a loop to say we assume compatibilism. And I think the reason for that is it doesn't take a philosopher to come up with an argument like this, right? The kind of apparent tension between determinism on the one hand and freedom on the other is so apparent that often people say, oh, incompatibilism is the intuitive position. There, I think there might just be some talking past each other. So I'm with Taylor, kind of just given how weak of a logical claim it is to say free will and determinism are compatible, we ought to think that unless we have a reason to think otherwise. That seems to me the right position. And now I just say, and I think we've got a lot of reasons to think otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go ahead and move then to your second argument.
Sure.
You said you had two, so let me shift. Okay, the manipulation argument. Yeah,
so as I see it, these two arguments, now there's many different versions of the consequence argument, so also there's many different versions of the manipulation argument. I assume in the interview with Peerboom, he probably talked about his four-case argument, which is another very interesting manipulation argument. So I'm presenting these two because it seems to me kind of across time, something like these two arguments seem to be the most common things people give in defense of incompatibilism. So the core idea behind the manipulation argument is that there's no moral responsibility difference between some agents that are manipulated in ways that clearly undermine their moral responsibility and agents in ordinary deterministic world. So kind of as a first pass, kind of in a very bare bones way of thinking about the argument, the thought is something like, hey, look, we look at these manipulated agents and they're obviously not responsible. And then we compare these manipulated agents to agents in deterministic worlds and we say, there's not actually any interesting difference between the two. So since these manipulated agents are obviously not responsible, we should conclude that these deterministic agents are also not responsible. So to put a little bit more flesh on that, I give you Al Mealy's zygote argument, which is probably with Dirk Peerboom's four-case argument, the two most commonly discussed versions of the manipulation argument. So Mealy asks us to imagine there's some goddess Diana, and for whatever reason, she wants someone murdered, but she doesn't want to do it herself. She doesn't want to get her hands dirty, at least directly. And so using her goddess-like knowledge and her goddess-like powers and being in her deterministic world, she creates a zygote. And that zygote is, or right, depending on your views here, develops into an agent Ernie who, given the state of his zygote, how it became into existence, given the laws of nature, was determined to perform this murder at this time. So again, right, the thought is something like Diana's got these really unusually powerful abilities as well as knowledge, such that it puts her in a position, given the deterministic laws in her universe, to create this zygote, such that that zygote will be guaranteed in, let's say, 30 years from now to murder somebody. Okay, so intuitively, I think we want to say, well, in that case, Ernie wouldn't be to blame for murdering, and thus he wouldn't be free in his murdering, right? He seems to be a mere puppet or plaything of Diana. Okay, so that's the case, and now Mealy gives this argument in light of the case. He says, premise one, this is just a quote from him, says, because of the way his zygote was produced in his deterministic universe, Ernie is not a free agent and is not morally responsible for anything. Concerning the free action and moral responsibility of beings into whom the zygote develops, there's no significant difference between the way Ernie's zygote came to exist and the way normal human zygote come to exist in a deterministic universe. So determinism is incompatible with free action and moral responsibility. So notice there's kind of two ways people will try. Notice also this argument only gets you incompatibilism, right? This doesn't tell you we are free. It's just saying, hey, incompatibilism is true. Kind of two, you might deny premise one, you might deny premise two. Denying premise one is often called the hardline response to the manipulation argument. Here we just say Ernie's just free. He's just responsible. And I guess it's called the hard line because it's hard to believe. There's then what's called the soft line reply, and that's a reply to premise two. And I guess it's a gentler reply. And the key thing there is we try to say, oh, you've missed, there is a really important difference between, say, Ernie and normally deterministic agents. So kind of one way is to say, oh, Ernie and determinist agents aren't alike actually at all. There's big differences between them. That's called the soft line reply. The hard line reply says, actually, there aren't any difference, but since ordinary deterministic agents are responsible, I guess Ernie turns out to be responsible as well.
Okay. All right. So those were two arguments. Now, Perry Boom offers this argument. Bignon offered some replies to it. So I would encourage the viewers to hear how a compatibilist, might try and object. You said what they would say, but maybe their justification for rejecting it. Go check out that interview with Dr. Bignon. But what I want to get to now is some objections to libertarianism. So we're going to shift.
Sure.
So let me here are 4 objections that you laid out, and I may bring up additional ones, but the number one I want to focus on, the problem of luck. So this is a problem that's often used to target libertarianism. So I know some people have said, no, the problem of luck is a problem for everybody that affirms free will, but let's focus on libertarianism here. So what is this problem?
Sure. So let's imagine imagine kind of a famous case of Martin Luther, his refusal to recant at the Diet of Worms, right? And let's imagine that this refusal to recant, right? So we're thinking of Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, who's asked to recant various propositions he's put forth in understanding how things like salvation work. And he's commanded to recant, and he says, I refuse. Here I stand. I can do no other. Let's just suppose that his action was free, and let's suppose libertarianism is true. So that seems to mean that his choice to refuse to recant was undetermined. But now, if you begin to think about what indeterminism implies, it begins to make Martin Luther's choice look lucky or random. So it seems like on this view, hold everything fixed about Martin Luther, kind of all the work he's done so far to defend this, what's soon going to be called Protestant understanding of salvation by faith alone, all the work he's invested in it, his personality, his desires, his character. And if libertarianism is true, he could have recanted or he could have refused. And there's nothing else to say about it. In fact, it looks like on the libertarian view, for any free choice you make, it was possible, given everything holding the same about you, your desires, your beliefs, your upbringing, your social situation, you could have done something else. And so then people want to say, well, what explains why you do one thing rather than another? If you ask somebody, hey, why'd you go to such and such a college? They'll probably say something like, oh, well, I thought it was the best college to go to. But then on the libertarian view is like, but you still didn't have to go there. So why'd you go there? And then their thought seems to be, there just seems to be something capricious or random or inexplicable about undetermined choices. There's really ultimately, sometimes the way it says, nothing that explains them.
A follow-up on that, is this, I've heard, I think Peter Van Inwagen offer this rollback thought experiment or analogy or something like that. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of just stick with the Martin Luther example for a second. Suppose we're kind of, as it were, watching this and we have something like a remote control. And so we watch him say, here I stand, I can do no other. And then we hit rewind. And then we, rewind it 15 seconds and hit play again. I'm like, okay, what's he going to do this time? And then he says, here I stand, I can do no other. And then we rewind it and play again. And then he says, I think I'm going to recant. I'm like, oh, that's kind of surprising. Let's rewind it again. And we just keep rewinding it and playing it back. And let's say we do this like 1,000 times because we have nothing else to do. And after 1,000 times, we find the kind of distribution of situation, or the distribution of choices between choosing to recant and choosing to refuse to recant to be about 50-50. What's going to be our impression after watching that? Van Wagen's thought is maybe after watching that, we're going to start to think, is he really responsible? I mean, it just seems like it's kind of random. I rewind it. Sometimes he does this. I rewind it. Sometimes it does this. Now, notice we don't change things. It's not like we rewind it and give Martin Luther very different motivations. Or it's not like we rewind it and bring in very different events to change him. Everything's exactly the same. And yet sometimes he does this and sometimes do that. It just seems like, a radioactive particle decaying. Sometimes it does it this way and sometimes it does it that way. That's all to say.
Okay. So then it just looks like what ends up actually happening. It doesn't look like that was a free action. It was just lucky. It just kind of was random, turned out that way. Didn't have to. Everything else stayed the same.
Yeah.
Okay. So, this seems like a good challenge to me to libertarianism. So I'm curious, how do you respond to this objection?
I do think a lot of people find this really intuitive. I think, kind of the full work in which I would try to respond to this is I think we have to get really careful of what people mean by lucky. And I think the reason for that is I just think people have different intuitions here and different things will help different people. So one of the most famous presentations of the luck argument comes in Hume's Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, which was published in the 18th century. And when Hume presents it, he's under what I would think is the mistaken assumption that where there's no determinism, there's no causation. So his thought is something like, hey, look, if your action is undetermined, then it's not caused by anything. And so doesn't that make it random? And my response to that is, yeah, it does. But that's not the libertarian account, right? In the libertarian account, you are genuinely causing that action. So sometimes people think, oh, indeterminism is lucky because it's non-causation. There's another way of thinking about it, though, often has to do something like explanation. Seems like as we're watching that rollback scenario, nothing really explains why Martin Luther chooses, say, to recant when he chooses to recant, or chooses not to recant when he chooses not to recant. So there, too, I think we have to be careful of what we mean by explanation. So take the case in which he recants. Can we explain why? And he didn't actually recant, but imagine a different scenario in which he did. Could we explain that? Of course we could explain that. I mean, he was raised in the Catholic Church, and refusing to obey the Pope was for a long time thought to be, one of literally the worst things he could possibly have done. He was watching the church get ripped apart in various kinds of ways. His own life was in turmoil. It's been very easy for him to have recanted. So it seems like, to me, in cases in which he recant, easily you could explain it. But it seems like to me, we could also explain why he would refuse to recant. He really was convinced that the Pope, in much Christian teaching, was in error, that the scriptures actually taught something differently, and he felt compelled to defend that. So it seems to me like, in some sense of explanation, both actions are easily explained. Now, there is a sense of explanation in which we can't explain it. So there's no motive, there's no belief, there's no character trait, there's no psychological feature of Luther such that prior to his refusal to recant, it guaranteed he would recant. So that's the case. It really is the case that there's nothing prior to Luther's choice to refuse to recant that guarantees he recants. But for me, that actually seems to suggest he is free, right? If there were something about my situation, something about my psychology, such that given that situation or given that psychology, or maybe both, there's nothing else I could have done than what I actually did. I mean, that is an explanation, all right, but it seems to me an explanation that undermines moral responsibility. Let me try to make the point in a slightly different way. I have the exact opposite intuition of Van Wagen. Okay, if I'm replaying Luther, if I replay it 1,000 times and every single time he refuses to recant, that would make me wonder about his freedom. Because I take it Luther's choice is what Mark Ballagher calls a torn choice. He's deeply torn about what to do at this time. And it seems like what we'd actually expect if we rolled it back is that given that he was deeply torn about what to do, sometimes he would go one way, sometimes he would go another way. So it seems to me actually what we would hope would happen if we rolled back our situations is, yeah, sometimes we would go this way and sometimes we would go that way. So I don't mean to suggest to dismiss this problem too quickly. The general strategy is to say, look, you got to get really, really clear about what we mean by luck. And I think once you do, one of two things will happen. Either you realize libertarians just aren't committed to that kind of luck, or that kind of luck isn't responsibility undermining. Happy to hear pushback on that, though.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely share that intuition that if there is some condition that we can point to explain why Luther did this versus Luther did that, if there is some condition, then now that just sounds very much deterministic. That sounds right to me. So I'm with you on that. So the challenge though is, so now I've crossed off the list. Okay, so there's no condition. And it's just when there's no condition now and everything else, and I mean everything else is exactly the same, but one time this happens and one time this other thing happens. I don't know how to shake it. I just have this intuition like, so then it was just chance. Like to me, that's what I'm thinking of. Well, you might say, well, what do you mean by chance? Just like, well, what do you mean by luck?
Yeah, I think
I guess I need to think about how I'm defining it.
I think I certainly don't want to dismiss the intuition, but I think the challenge that the libertarian wants to push back just immediately is to say, like, you got that intuition, great, tell me more about it. And particularly, can you tell me what's missing? And I think what often happens is once you say, well, I really feel like this should have happened, like he rolled it back, he should have always done the same thing. And they say, well, wait a second, actually, wouldn't that actually seem to undermine his moral responsibility? In fact, it doesn't seem to be a good thing. So I think the kind of intuition has to be articulated. And I'll just assert it. My assertion about the problem of luck is once you articulate the intuition there, you'll realize actually, right, it's misunderstanding libertarianism, like say Hume was, or actually it's positing something that so far from seeming helpful for freedom, like always doing the same thing given this past condition, it actually undermines it. Now that's a kind of bold claim, but that's my contention about the problem of luck. It's a kind of problem that seems really problematic until we articulate carefully what the intuition is, and once on close inspection, it evaporates.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I want to move to these other objections.
Sure.
So let me put that back up on the screen. The second type of objection to free will or libertarian free will is the problem of rationality.
Yeah. So here it just seems like, take a case where you've done something wrong. What would it take to be blameworthy for doing that? It seems like, at least if you read your Aristotle, there's two conditions. One is you need control. Okay, let's put that off actually for a side. But it also seems like you have to know it was wrong, right? If you did something that was wrong, but you, through no fault of your own, were ignorant of it, then it seems like you're not to blame. So there's kind of two ways of getting people off the hook. One is saying, they were ignorant. The other is saying is they lacked control. But now that means if I do something wrong, the only way I could have been to blame for it is that I judged what I did was wrong. But that means if libertarianism is free, imagine I'm in a situation and I judge something that I do is right. I say, okay, the right thing to do, Martin Luther says, the right thing for me to do is to refuse to recant. Well, in libertarianism, for his choice to refuse to recant to be free must mean he must have been able to choose to recant. That is, choose to argue against his judgment about what the best thing is. So on the libertarian view, not only do you need freedom from, say, the past or freedom from the laws, hey, that sounds pretty good. You also need freedom, it looks like, for your own judgment about what's best. Because after all, if you judge what's best and you can't do otherwise than that, then now it looks like your action's determined by your judgment, and thus your action or your choice isn't free. And thus it looks like the libertarian conception of free will requires something like the freedom to act irrationally, contrary to your best judgment. And that doesn't sound so good.
Okay, so how do you respond to this one?
Yeah, well, people go one of two ways on this. Sometimes people actually want to churn back the responsibility and say it's actually your judgment that's the locus of freedom. So rather than thinking of the choice being the locus of freedom, kind of the real locus of freedom is judgment. So that's one way of going. Let's put that aside, because maybe that just kind of rolls back all the problems. Sometimes people think that. So I guess we have to think of again what's kind of desirable in an agent. So is it desirable in an agent that you always do what your reason tells you? Now, people may have different intuitions about that. My intuition is yes. I'm pretty Aristotelian about this. It would be better for me if I was the agent who always acted in accordance with my reason. I think to act against my reason is a kind of mistake. So I'd rather be the kind of agent who never did that. Okay, now take two possibilities. Would you rather be the kind of agent who's programmed into always acting in accordance with right reason? So it's not a character trait you develop. It's not something you do on your own. That's just the way you're programmed, totally beyond your control. Or would it be better to be made into the kind of agent who, through her own free choices, develops herself into the kind of agent who freely follows her own judgment? I want to at least suggest that's a harder question. As a libertarian, I think I've got the intuition that there's something valuable lost by depriving me of the opportunity of choosing to do the right thing. Now, it is the case that by giving me the ability to do something wrong, that opens me up to something that's undesirable. But the hope is not that I'll do the wrong thing, but is rather with the opportunity to do the wrong, I nonetheless choose the right. And so the comparison here, I think, can't be what's better, to act, with reason or against reason. There, it's obvious. Well, with reason. But that's not the comparison. The comparison is this. Is it better to be a kind of agent who has no ability to act contrary to reason? Or is it rather better to be the kind of agent who has the freedom to make herself into the kind of agent who always freely follows her own judgment? And there I want to say, sounds like the second one would be a better kind of agent. Better to be the kind of agent who, through your own choices, has sided with reason against irrationality.
Okay, I'm moving a little faster.
Yeah, please.
We're coming up on an hour. So the third, having trouble pulling it up. The third objection to libertarian free will is that this determinism, indeterminism stuff is just irrelevant to our moral responsibility.
Yeah, this is a really prominent objection, especially in the wake of work by a 20th century philosopher known as P.F. Strossonian. I'll just give a kind of real intuitive presentation, maybe of 3 and 4, and then we can decide what we want to do after that. But the idea is think about when you're interacting with friends and they do something wrong and they try to get themselves off the hook. Like, what are the kinds of things they normally say? They might say things like, oh, hey, look, I forgot about that, or I was really tired about this, or things like that. But notice, if you actually pay attention to the kinds of things we say about what makes us responsible and what doesn't make us responsible, no one talks about determinism. So when you try to understand what it takes to be morally responsible, the contention of the Strossonian is determinism is this kind of weird foreign consideration. And if you consider actually our exchanges of moral responsibility, of blame, exculpation, and forgiveness, you'll see you need nothing like libertarianism. So the libertarianism is kind of this, arises from looking at the things at a too abstract a level. And if you pay careful attention to our actual exchanges, you'll see that, hey, nothing like libertarianism is required for moral responsibility. And if you remember, right, what gets libertarianism going is this idea that that's the kind of control you need for moral responsibility. And that's what the Strossonian is trying to cut off. The final consideration I think manifests itself in two interesting situations. So first, there's a lot of naturalists, so people who think that there's no God or nothing like God, and all that exists in some sense is the natural world. And they want to say something like, hey, libertarianism sounds great, but given that naturalism is true, we just know we aren't those kinds of creatures. So this isn't someone who like looks at the consequence argument and says, hey, that's no good, or the manipulation argument says, hey, that's no good. It's rather someone who says, hey, if you look at the natural world, you'll just see we could not possibly be libertarian agents, because that would accord us powers that really would make us too sharp of a break with other natural creatures. That's one way it manifests itself. Others are in theological context. There's a lot of people, I regularly teach classes on this, and I'll just kind of give an example. I regularly will have students who come from, say, a Calvinistic persuasion, and they'll hear the arguments from Incompatibilism and they'll say, those are good arguments. I'm not actually exactly sure what to say about that, but I know libertarianism is false because the Bible says it's false. And so there the thought is something like, we have these pre-existing set of knowledge, naturalism, one way it goes, kind of certain interpretation of scripture in the other way, and that just takes libertarianism right off the table. So that's a kind of interesting position where sometimes they'll concede all the force of the argument and nonetheless say, but nonetheless you can't accept it because of this background consideration or that background consideration.
Okay, so I want to leave time for the implications of your views. So just briefly, how do you respond to at least that last objection?
Well, I think it's a good structural objection. I mean, I've got the view that if the Bible asserts things that entail that libertarianism is false, then libertarianism is false. So that seems to me, I think, hey, that's a good kind of objection to press. I'm very confident about the authority of scripture. So that I think is a really kind of pressing worry. There, of course, the devil's in the details, right? So for those kinds of students, you just have to say, well, which passages are you thinking about? One thing maybe I could say that might be interesting is that doesn't get into the details. Notice, you might read scripture and think scripture actually isn't perfectly clear on this. Like you might say, there are some passages that seem to kind of speak of a more kind of determining God, a God who determines our choices. And there's other passages that seem to speak to a kind of God who allows things to go contrary to his will. And so you might actually think that the kind of biblical scriptures are, as it were, what we might call undetermined. In that case, then I think philosophical libertarianism is going to have a really good chance of making a case, because you say, well, look, if the Bible's not totally clear, then maybe what we should let settle the debate is libertarianism. So I say that just to say it's not enough to think maybe the Bible suggests Calvinism or some other kind of theological determinism view. I think you have to be really confident that it really requires that. Whereas I think there's a lot of passages that are a lot less clear and allow for a lot more leeway. That said, I actually just think, I'm not a Calvinist partly because I think that's just what the Bible teaches, teaches that Calvinism is false. So I'm all for that kind of argument in structure.
It was really interesting to me when I interviewed Dr. Bignon. It seemed like actually when I asked him, why do you think compatibilism is true? He spent the bulk of his time there laying out these kinds of biblical considerations, actually. Yeah. So kind of various types of Calvinist proof texts. Now, he also gave like some theological reasons. I may bounce one of these off of you and then we'll shift to implications. So one way that you could object to the libertarian is to say, well, wait a minute. It seems like we do have at least this case where compatibilism looks right. So I can press on your claim that incompatibilism is true. Here's a case. Look at God. Look at his free will. He's praiseworthy, but he doesn't have the ability to do the wrong thing. He's just got this one. He does the right thing. That's the one option he has. Yet, when it gets to the question of his moral responsibility, we can praise him for his actions. He's actually praiseworthy. So that looks like a case where God looks determined to do a certain thing, and he's also praiseworthy. So that looks like compatibilism is true.
Yeah, it's a great worry. So I just I sign up for Anselm's solution to this problem. He explicitly considers this. I believe it's just in his dialogue on free will, and it also might be on the fall of the devil. I'm forgetting which one of it, but it's in one of those two works. And Anselm says, when you think about free will, I can't remember exactly how he defines it, but it's something to the effect of, let's just define free will as something like being the ultimate source of your action. There's nothing outside of you that determines it. And so he actually doesn't define free will as involving the ability to do otherwise. He says, rather, free will is the ability to be the ultimate source of your action. And he says, when it comes to God and creatures, this manifests itself differently, because for God, given his infinity, given that nothing brought him into existence, he need only do what's right. And in fact, maybe only be able to do what's right, because there's nothing outside of him determining him to do that. It's all within his own nature. But humans, given that we have a starting point, given that we have a kind of finitude, for us to be the ultimate source of our actions requires us to have the ability to do otherwise. Because after all, if we were determined, then we wouldn't be the ultimate source of our actions, but say, and kind of most problematically, God would be the ultimate source of our actions, even our sins. So for Anselm, he thinks it'd be wrong to say what's free will, the ability to do otherwise, because he thinks God's free and he can't do otherwise. Rather, free will is something like to be the ultimate source of your actions, but then the kind of creature you are might imply that you do need the ability to do otherwise. And he thinks that's exactly what it is in the case of humans. But look, it's a good objection to press. And it certainly, I think, complicates our kind of stock definitions, right? Because I do have the view that God is free. And so I want to be able to accommodate that intuition as well.
Okay, a couple more objections here based on those other interviews. I said I'd tack some on. We just reached the hour point, and I told you we'd go for an hour. So about how much more time do you have?
I don't know. Keep going.
Are you
like
good
10,
with maybe
10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes?
15, yeah. Somewhere between 15, 20 more minutes, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so let me throw a couple more objections at you. So another way to like press on your claim that incompatibilism is true is to present you Frankfurt cases. So what do you maybe remind the viewer what a Frankfurt case is, but what do you do with Frankfurt cases?
Yeah, so Frankfurt cases are cases in which an agent seems to be both intuitively morally responsible for her action and yet couldn't do otherwise. But the reason she couldn't do otherwise is this very unusual reason. It involved what's called a counterfactual intervener. The key is that the intervener is counterfactual, but she doesn't actually intervene. So the Frankfurt's original case, I think, was something like, I might botch the names, but it's something like Black desires Smith to murder Jones. And so he's implanted a chip in Smith's brain to monitor it, such that if he sees Smith about to not decide to murder Smith, he'll intervene and cause Jones to murder Smith. Okay, so he's ready and poised to intervene if he has to. He's got this chip in Smith's brain, and I botched the names there. Smith's brain, and if it shows a kind of brain activity that shows that Smith's going to refrain from killing Jones, then Black will intervene and cause Smith to kill Jones. But as it actually stands, Smith just decides to do it on his own. So Black doesn't have to intervene. Smith chooses to kill Jones for his own reasons and carries out the action. Now, in this kind of case, it seems like Smith is responsible. We should blame him for killing Jones, but also seems like he couldn't have done otherwise, because after all, if he was about to do otherwise, Black would have intervened and forced him to do what he would actually do. So here, the typical response now is to say there's a kind of dilemma. How in the world did Black know what Smith was about to do? And it seems like either it's got to be the case that Smith's action was determined, and so then let's just suppose Black knew the laws of the past or something like this, so he could predict with 100% certainty that he was going to murder Jones on his own, or he didn't know with 100% certainty. Okay, but if he knew with 100% certainty what Smith was about to do, now, at least if you're a libertarian or incompatibilist, you're not going to think he's responsible, because now his action is determined. But if Black couldn't predict with 100% certainty what Smith was going to do, then it still seems like Smith has at least some wiggle room. Sometimes this is called a flicker of freedom to do otherwise. He could have at least begun to make a choice not to kill Smith, and then Black would have intervened. So it seems like the sense in which Smith chose to do it on his own was that he had some kind of freedom to begin to do something else that would have then forced Smith to intervene. Now, I mean, at this point, what happens is you get increasingly complex Frankfurt kind of cases. I myself think that's evidence that this is a research project gone bad, right? Like when you've got a theory to explain something, and the only way your theory works is you make it more and more and more and more complex. Like that's what they tried to do with the geocentric view, right? They kept adding little things into it to try to make it work. But the problem is the cases still seem not to be able to get rid of it, right? And so I think even the very fact that the cases have to get so complex, people start to give them, and they ask, what's your intuition? And people think, I'm not sure. So I think that, in my view, that dilemma that was first put forth back in the 90s kind of spelled the doomsday for the Frankfurt style cases.
Okay, 2 more objections that this one's going to come from Perry Boom, my interview with him. So when I interviewed him and I got to, so you think libertarianism's false? Why do you think it's false? And he pressed this. He said that basically, I'm paraphrasing him, but it was basically like, the main problem is that our choices, they produce events in your brain and the rest of your body. And those events seem like they're governed by physical laws. And he essentially wanted to press like, that means that libertarianism runs into like this kind of, it conflicts with science. That was the impression I was getting from him. You may have a better idea of his particular objection to libertarianism, but that it was this. It seems like you run into an actual conflict with science.
Yeah, I mean, did you talk about wild coincidences?
I don't remember him using that phrase, and I don't want to suggest. He was clear that he's not a determinist. He doesn't think that's true, but nonetheless, it sounded like he wanted to say it just doesn't. It doesn't seem well evidenced given what we know about science.
Yeah, there's a couple. There might be a couple worries one has there. Some people have this worry that free will can't be law governed. Now, I don't think it can be governed by deterministic laws. I'm an incompatibilist. But it seems to me that there could be probabilistic laws, like maybe when I go in to the restaurant, given my current psychology, given kind of the food offerings on the menu, I don't know, maybe the atmosphere, who knows what's influencing me here. It's something like, 70% chance I'm going to choose the salad and 30% chance I'm going to choose the sandwich. And in that sense, so it's governed by probabilistic laws. There are some people say free will just can't be like that. So that could be a kind of worry. So perhaps what Pierboom's trying to say there is something like, hey, look, given what we know about science, we know the natural world is law governed. And so given that free will, whether you're a dualist, materialist, however you think, is going to have effects in the brain, whether your choices just are brain events, or even if you're a dualist, you're going to bring about changes in the brain. And so that means free will is going to have to be law governed. And that's a problem. So that could be a kind of worry you have. Another worry you might have is that the laws about your brain are totally independent of your kind of, as it were, psychology. So here the worry would be something like, hey, look, given your psychology, maybe it's 70% chance you'll choose the salad and 30% chance the sandwich. But given your neuronal activity, it's 90% chance likely you'll choose the sandwich and 10% likely that you'll choose the salad. And that seems like a kind of problematic discrepancy. So another worry you might have is something like physics just fixes the laws for all physical events, regardless of any kinds of psychological happenings. That I think would be really problematic. I think Tim O'Connor is a really important libertarian who's done a lot of work of what he calls downward causation. And very, very simply put, this is the idea that psychological events choices, if we're to be free, need to be such that those affect the microphysical happenings in my brain. So in some sense, it needs to be that my choices affect what happens in my brain. And in that case, I think that just means the laws that say what happened in your brain have to take into account what's also happening in your psychology. And that doesn't seem like there's anything about what we know about current science that makes that problematic. So if current science shows we can totally predict what happens in your brain without ever referencing your psychology, there's at least a worry to be had there, but I'm not seeing the scientific evidence for that.
Okay. Well, I may save that last objection for after we finish the interview. I may just ask you before we get off. So let's go ahead and shift to this last question, which is, okay, you've defended libertarianism. You know, you laid out your reasons for thinking it's true. You responded to some objections, but now we want to know, what are the implications of libertarianism for Christian theology?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of things you might say here. I did my best to kind of both identify things I thought people often were mistaken about, and or things that were just potentially interesting, where interesting might mean you find it really problematic, or interesting might mean you're pretty excited about that implication. So one is that God can't determine and necessitate how people act freely. Now, you got to be really careful with this claim. Often, when I first present, say, a libertarianism, and I teach at a Christian college, and so when I first present it to students, they'll say, oh, that means God can't determine what we do. And you say, nope, that's not the case. God could determine what you do. For all I know, take kind of the prophecy in Isaiah about God bringing up Cyrus to come in and conquer the Babylonians. Maybe God determined Cyrus to do that. I mean, I'm not sure how God did it. It's just that if God determined Cyrus to do that, then Cyrus's action wasn't free. And moreover, if I know that Cyrus's action was free, then I know that means God didn't determine him to do that. Now, we also want to distinguish determining and influencing. Often people say things, well, if he can't determine it, then God can't influence anything. But that's obviously false. Like, I have all kinds of ways I influence my children, but I cannot determine them, right? So here we want to recognize God has a lot of leeway of how he can act, right? He can determine, as far as I can tell, anybody he wants to. It's just that their action wouldn't be free. And even for free actions, he can influence them all kinds of ways. But if libertarianism is true, you are committed to the claim that God cannot determine how people freely act. And for some people, that raises worries about omnipotence. Like, is God really omnipotent then? You know, for others, that raises worries about sovereignty. Like, is he really then sovereign over how things unfold? Maybe we'll come back to that. So that's one. Two.
Before you get to number two, let me say this. There have been about 14 or 15 viewers consistently the whole time watching live, and some people pop in and pop out. But if you have a question for Dr. Franklin, and there are already a few in the live chat, if you've got a question for him, go ahead and put it in the live chat right now, because once he finishes these next 2 points, we're going straight to the Q&A. All right, go ahead and finish those last 2 points out.
So the second one, I think this is perhaps a more interesting one, is that it seems like on libertarianism, everyone who goes to hell could have been in heaven. Now, one hard thing about the question of what is libertarianism's implications for Christian theology, of course, depends on, well, what do you think Christian theology says? So I realize people might have different views about hell and so on and so forth, but it seems pretty natural to think anyone who's in hell deserves to be there. I think that's a pretty common Christian view, that if someone's in hell, they deserve to be there. But now notice we said that if someone deserves something, then they had to be able to do otherwise. And so if someone deserves to be in hell, that means they must have been able to avoid to be in hell. And at least on my view of the afterlife, there's only two possible places, ultimately, heaven or hell, right? So thus, on the libertarian view, anyone, right, everyone who goes to hell could have been in heaven. As far as I can tell, for me, that's a really good result of this kind of view. This seems to me to be something that helps safeguard kind of Christian doctrine and biblical teachings about God's loving each and every one and never taking pleasure in the death of a sinner and desiring all to be saved. And so right here, notice on if we assume that hell means someone deserves to be there, then it follows from libertarianism that they could have been in heaven. And that's an important implication, for better or worse. The last one, this one can get real complicated. So let me just kind of try to give a little bit of a superficial description here. So if Molinism is false, then God takes risks. Okay, so I know you've done some videos on Molinism, so we can refer the listeners to that. I have to say that because Molinism is an interesting way of kind of trying to combine libertarianism with what's called a strong view of providence. But if Molinism turns out to be false, and I think I'll say at least most major contributors to this debate who are Christian libertarians think Molinism is false, then God ends up taking risks. And here I use William Hasker, a famous defender of a kind of risky view of providence. He says, God takes risks if he decides to bring something about, but allows the success of the decision to depend on how free creatures act. And his decision is it not itself informed by his knowledge of how free creatures would or will act. So the thought here is God puts Adam and Eve in the garden, and that decision is a risk insofar as God obviously wants them to obey. He doesn't want them to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but nonetheless, the success of that project, i.e. them obeying him, he allows to depend on their own free choices. And God doesn't base his decision on his prior knowledge. He doesn't say something like, oh, well, I see they're going to refrain, so I'm going to put them in the garden. So God takes a genuine risk. And this, I think, if Molinism is false, is probably one of the most controversial implications of libertarianism. A lot of people think, kind of seems to me historically, Christians have not been risky providence view people. And there seems to be some scripture that speaks against this as well. How do we square this with things like, if God takes risks, can he completely know the future? If God takes risks, can he be really genuinely sovereign? And so people often worry about how libertarianism seems to undermine a kind of classical Christian view of a God who's in full providential control with full knowledge of what's going to happen.
Okay, so it's time to go to Q&A. I'll thank you again at the end, but let me go ahead and thank you now. This was really good. I really enjoyed this whole interview. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Q&A here. First up, Samuel Barusa. Has Dr. Franklin read Guillaume Bignon's book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God? If so, what does he think of it?
I have not.
All right. The next one is coming from BDS. Okay, yeah. He gave a $5 super chat. Why can I not put that on the screen? Huh. There we go. Thank you so much for giving me that super chat. I really appreciate it. So he asked, he says, let's open a can of worms. Does God have free will?
Yes. I mean, it seems like, at least I want to say about God, that there's nothing outside of God that determines him to do anything he does. So that might be one kind of basis of saying he has free will. There's nothing outside of him that forces him to do one thing or another. That said, you might respond to that claim and say, but that's not enough, because for God to have free will, he needs to be able to do a range of things. Earlier I was suggesting, Anselm thought that was false. I think that also might be false, but let's just say, actually, no, for God really to have free will, he needs to be able to do more than one thing. But how can we make sense of God doing that, right? Doesn't God always know what's best? And given God's perfect virtue, won't he always do what's best? And so how can God possibly be free? One way of trying to respond to this is a couple of things. One is just to say there's no actual best. In the sense of kind of as you go up levels of kind of better, you never actually get to the upper limit such that there's nothing better kind of beyond that. And so the idea that God could do best would actually require him to do something that's logically impossible. There is actually no best. So that's one way people have tried to respond. Another kind of way is just to go totally the opposite direction and say, oh, there is an upper bound of best. There's just a lot of things there, right? There's a lot of things that are tied for best. And so God's freedom manifests itself in being able to select from a range of those kinds of choices. So those would be, kind of three ways of trying to preserve God's freedom. First, to say all his freedom requires him to be the ultimate source of his action, and he is that. Another's to say, well, there's really no upper bound, so God has a range of options. Another to say there is an upper bound, but it's populated by multiple options. There's like many things he could have done.
For a really fascinating interview on that topic, go check out my interview with Dr. Klaas Cray. He defends that there is a best possible world. There's only one of them, and it's the multiverse. So it's a neat idea. We also did another interview of how saying there's no best world can be turned into an argument against the existence of God. So both of those interviews are really interesting. Okay. Next question comes from Tony. Curious to know if Chris is making a contribution to new essays on theological determinism.
Well, I'd have to know what that book is. So I'm going to guess I'm not making a contribution to it, but I'm still open to solicitation.
Okay. Let me jump down here to Tim's question. And this looks like the last one I have in the live chat. So if you've got another one, put it in the live chat. Otherwise, it's going to be it. Tim asks, what is the metaphysical difference between free choice and random choice? You said both should produce the same observations after rewinding, but what's intrinsically different about them?
Yeah. So the way I'm understanding that question is something like, we could imagine the rewinding with Martin Luther, but now we could imagine rewinding with some particle, and sometimes it decays and sometimes it doesn't. And the thought is, one seems random, one seems to involve metaphysical free choice. So how do you understand the difference between those? Here, I think a couple things are important. So first of all, these kind of particles just don't have the kinds of capabilities we think are required of free choice. For example, they have no beliefs, they have no desires. In fact, they have no psychology whatsoever. So the difference, I'm not sure, has to do with the kind of indeterminism involved. That might actually be the same in both cases. The difference has to do with the kind of thing that's undetermined, right? So in the case of Martin Luther, it's a thing capable of forming beliefs, capable of forming choices, capable of deliberating, and so on and so forth, whereas the particle has none of those kinds of things. So I'm not inclined to think the difference between the kind of random choice and free choice is like a different kind of indeterminism, but rather it's indeterminism in a certain kind of thing. To put the point slightly differently, merely introducing indeterminism into a system doesn't guarantee free choice. Right. So you can introduce, maybe you can introduce indeterminism into a computer, but that's not going to guarantee free choice. It's also going to need the right kind of psychology. It's going to need a will, the ability to make choices. It's going to need reason, the ability to evaluate choices. And my thought is something like, if you've got all that right psychological background, all that right cognitive and volitional development, then if you introduce indeterminism, you've got free will.
Yeah. I think the hang up for me is that all the psychology, the desires, the motivations, whatever, seems irrelevant to the choice, because when one action's taken, all those same motivations, desires, blah, 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 were there as when the other action was taken. And so it seems like you're back in the position of that particle where, everything is held equal, but the only difference is what ended up happening. Everything else was the same. So I don't know if the psychology, maybe that's where I'm hung up. It seems like things that we would normally appeal to as, that's why the person chose that, are just absent. But maybe that just presses me back into that assumption of determinism. Yeah. And it's like, well, you're looking for something that, it sounds like you're looking for a deterministic story, Jordan. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to press on the intuition is think when you ask people what they did. Again, I think of the college question. Like, hey, why did you go to that college? And they say, I went to that college because my dad went there, and they had an attractive form of the major I wanted to pursue. Is it really the thought that given those considerations, there's nothing else they could have done? That doesn't strike me as intuitive at all. Something like, that moved them, but they could have chosen otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's not irrelevant because they didn't just randomly choose to go that. They chose to go to that school for those reasons. And if they didn't have those reasons, they probably wouldn't have considered that school at all. So it is true that those reasons don't on their own uniquely determine the choice, but they do, at the very least, they delimit the range of choices you might make. And that's important explanatory work. You wouldn't have made the choice had it not been for the reasons. So I'm not sure that goes the whole way, but maybe that at least helps make the intuition a little less intense.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to end it there. We've gone about 25 minutes past what I told you, but I really appreciate you taking this extra time with me.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having me, and thanks to those who asked questions and listened.
So lots of interviews are related to this, but go check out the playlist of videos. This is the last in the playlist. You'll hear the other views on human freedom. We've brought up Molinism, so go check out my interview with Philip Swinson on Molinism. We've brought up several others, so go check it out. And if you really like the content that you're seeing on this channel, subscribe, like this video, and consider becoming a patron. You can do that by clicking the link in the description below. We're actually starting a book club in January, so you'll get to meet a bunch of other people that are watching my videos and are excited about Christian philosophy. So you're able to join for any amount. All right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.